Hi gang, so price rises are happening again. It kind of doesn't matter if you're watching this just after release or years later, they're definitely still happening again. So in this video, I'm going to go through all of the mainline Warhammer games and calculate exactly how much it would cost someone to get started from scratch. Right, Warhammer's expensive. Well, kind of. It kind of depends what you compare it to. But yeah, a box of toy soldiers costs £30 to £50, and there are rulebooks and paints and tools and stuff to bear in mind. And if you're just starting out, well, that's a lot of stuff to buy. And to some degree, Games Workshop, the company that make Warhammer, have alleviated that with cool starter sets. But it's often the case that if you actually want to play a game with other people, a starter set isn't really enough. So in this video, I'm going to go through all of the mainline collectible Warhammer games and figure out how much it will currently cost to get started. Like, to really get started. To get all the rules and models you need to build and paint an army to a point where you could play a game against existing players at whatever the standard game size is for that game, including attending events. There are a load of different games we have to consider here. First, the big obvious two, Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar. The other battle games, Horus Heresy and Adeptus Titanicus, and then all of the smaller box games, Kill Team, Warcry, Underworlds, Blood Bowl, and Necromunda. At the time of recording, 40k is about to be updated, but we've not seen any sign that the amount of models you're going to need is going to get smaller, so let's assume that the army size is about the same. But before we get into starter sets and models, there's one other thing to consider. Hobby supplies. So almost all these games come with models, and those models need to be assembled and in almost every game painted, and that means supplies. Generally, you're going to need a hobby knife, some side cutters or snips, some glue, a brush or two, some primer, probably in a spray can, and of course some paints. There's loads of ways you can get these. You don't need special Warhammer branded things. Items like scalpels, brushes, and snips are all generic products. But Games Workshop and some of the other manufacturers do make hobby starter sets that contain a selection of paints and tools. Generally, whichever way I calculated this, it came out about the same. About £40 for all the basic tools you need, some primer, and let's say 10 paints. So just bear that in mind in addition to the costs coming up. For all of these, I'm doing the costs as per the Games Workshop website with the recommended retail prices. Of course, that's just after a price rise. And also, we should be aware that if you shop in various other stores, you might be able to get all this 10 to 20% cheaper. Okay, so let's start with the cheapest and then work our way up. The official, easiest, cheapest way to get into playing Warhammer is Warhammer Underworlds. Underworlds is a small-scale board game set in the same world and using the same models as Age of Sigmar. Each side consists of between 3 and 7 models and a deck of 32 cards. The game plays in about 45 minutes, and it's also one of the best written and balanced Warhammer games out there. And it's also the most cost-effective, like by far. The Underworld starter set contains 2 complete warbands and their cards, and all the boards, dice, and tokens you need to play, even to play in competitive events, and it costs £40. One slight issue is that the rules are updated every year, but they're available as a free download to replace the rulebook in the box. Alternatively, you can buy one of the current year's starter sets, which contains slightly fancier models and additional card decks to vary up the game. The current one is Gnarlwood, and it costs £65, and once you've got all the boards and stuff, additional warbands cost around £26. You don't need Gnarlwood and the starter set, just one or the other. 40 quid for everything you need to play the game is a pretty good deal, and by far the cheapest way into playing a Warhammer game, especially when you consider that it's the only game where organised events don't require you to paint the models, so you save there too. But there are a couple more in the under £100 bracket. Kill Team is Games Workshop's Warhammer 40k skirmish game. All the skirmish games that we're going to talk about are about the same size, about 10 to 12 models, and in Kill Team, a lot of those models can also be used in Warhammer 40k. Again, with this, the starter set contains everything you need to play. 2 kill teams, their rules, the core rules for the game, and all the boards, terrain, dice, and tokens you need to play for £65. After that, Games Workshop make expansion sets that are about £110, and they contain new terrain and 2 new teams, but not the core rules. They're just like an expansion. And then if you just want to buy individual teams, those are $37.50 each. You can also use Warhammer 40k models in Kill Team. Their rules are in a separate compendium book. And then you could get the rulebook separately, but that isn't much use if you're just starting. So yeah, Kill Team is our next entry at £65 for everything you need. Next up in terms of skirmish games is Blood Bowl, the game of fantasy football, clocking in at £95 for a starter set. Blood Bowl is one of the longest running and solid rule sets Games Workshop make, and the starter set, again, actually contains everything you need. 2 teams, their rosters, the core rules, and all the dice boards and tokens you need to play. Additional teams are available for $31.50. There's an annual Spike magazine almanac rules update, but it's mostly optional rules and rules for newly released teams rather than required reading, so it's very optional. 95 quid for the box set and you've got everything you need to play. Okay, next we've crossed the £100 mark, and from here it gets a little more complicated. Warcry is the fantasy skirmish game, about the same size in terms of models as Kill Team and Blood Bowl. Your faction contains about 10 to 15 models forming a warband fighting in the Chaos Wastes. Unlike the others though, there is no starter set currently available. Warcry is released as a series of box sets, each of which is £110 and contains 2 warbands, boards, scenery, but not the core rules. Instead, the core rules are available as a separate book or as a free download. Additional warbands cost $37.50, same as Kill Team. And like that game, there are rules for using Age of Sigmar miniatures as your warband and various printed and downloadable books that contain their rules. But if you're starting from scratch, it's basically $110 for everything you need. But we should probably point out here that if you already have friends that play these skirmish games, you could get into it a lot cheaper. In Warcry, the terrain sets are required for play, but if the people you play with already have them, well then you just need a box of models and the download rules, £37.50. Or if you've already got some Age of Sigmar models, then just the download rules, so free. You could do a similar thing with Blood Bowl and Kill Team, but because you need a rulebook, and in the case of Blood Bowl, some specialist dice, it very quickly gets to the point where you might as well buy the starter set. It's just a lot better deal. But if you don't get everything you need to play, then Warcry actually becomes the cheapest game to get into. Okay, next up is the final skirmish game. Necromunda is a bit of a weird one. It's a much more detailed game than the others, dealing with gang warfare in the underhive of the 41st millennium. It's a lot more complex and has tons and tons of expansions and options. It's almost like playing a role-playing game than playing a tight skirmish war game, and the rules are famously difficult to pin down. The current starter set, Hive War, contains 2 gangs, boards, terrain, dice, and tokens for £105, so that's comparable to the others, but it only contains a cut-down version of the rules with one specific build of each of the gangs, and that's not how most people actually play the game. Necromunda is played in a series of different campaigns. Your gang grows and gets better over time, and all the rules for that aren't in this box. To get the full core rules and the rules for the basic campaign type, the Dominion campaign, you'll need the Necromunda rulebook for £37.50, and to get full rules for your gang, you'll need to buy its house book for another £30. Gangs after that can be bought separately for £30 each, so you could just buy a gang and these 2 books and skip the starter set, but then you wouldn't have the dice, which are custom. They are occasionally released in limited edition sets, but if you can't get hold of them, then yeah, you'll need the starter set and a house book, and at least the core rulebook, which currently will set you back £172.50. Another option is the Ash Waste. This is a variant of Necromunda, which includes vehicles, and the Ash Waste box set includes 2 gangs, terrain, dice, tokens, and a full set of core rules and gang rules for both gangs, for both normal Necromunda and for the Ash Waste variant, barring a few odds and ends. So depending on what your local group is playing, the £185 Ash Waste box might actually be a better deal than getting all that separate stuff. But yeah, that is by far the most expensive skirmish game. Okay, so next up is the first non-skirmish game, Adeptus Titanicus. This is a bit of an odd one out. In Titanicus, you control giant stompy war machines making war during the Horus Heresy on a really tiny scale. It's one of the more complex games produced, and while you don't need many models to play, they do tend to be quite big, complex kits. The starter set's 105 and contains all the rules, tokens, and dice you need, plus plenty of models, but not quite enough models to play what's considered a standard-sized game. If you want to play a full-size game, around 1500 to 1750 points, you'll need to add more. A Warlord Titan is one of the most common ways to get your starter set up to size, and also the model everyone wants to add. So if you do that, you end up with a combined total of 175 quid for Adeptus Titanicus. And then we get to the big ones, the mass battle games that everyone knows Warhammer for, and these are a bit different. Age of Sigmar is the flagship fantasy battle game, and it's slightly more affordable than its sci-fi equivalent, Warhammer 40k. Both of these games have a selection of different size starter sets, and those can be useful if there are two of you trying to learn the game and not playing anyone else. But if you actually want to get a full-size army and play at local pickup games or at events, then the starter sets aren't very good value. Even the biggest ones that cost £110 and feature the full rules and 2 mini armies won't actually get you very far. Both games are billed as being able to be played in lots of different ways and at lots of different scales, but unfortunately in both games a kind of standard expected game size has become the default, and that game size in both games is match play with 2,000 point armies. If you want to get to that size, you're better off buying a rulebook, the codex and army book for your army, and then some models. Models are available in a load of different size sets, from single miniatures to squads, but usually the best way to build the army is to start with these sort of, bundle sets called Start Collecting, or Army Sets, or Combat Patrol, or a number of other different names. But again, none of them on their own give you a 2,000 point match play army. You just can't buy a 2,000 point match play army. Realistically, you'll need to start from one of these boxes and then expand it out with individual kits. In Age of Sigmar, there are a few good deals. 2 of these start collecting boxes would get you most of the way there, getting you 2,000 points for about 150 quid, regardless if that's actually any good as an army. But a quick adding up of popular tournament lists gives us model counts a little bit higher than that. This Stormcast list, one of the few that isn't just tons of dragons at the moment, is around £285 depending on how you build it. And of course there are much more expensive ways to build a 2,000 point army. This variance in Age of Sigmar is partly because AOS lists tend to be very heavy on great big expensive models, but you don't need to buy those things if you're just trying to get 2,000 points together. So to get to a playable standard list with Age of Sigmar, you'll need a rule source, that's either the main rulebook for 42 or the General's Handbook that contains the current match play rules for 30, you just need one of those, your army's army book for another 30, some dice and tape measures which should cost you a tenner, and then the models, which puts the total cost at somewhere between 220 at the extreme low end and upwards of 350 for some armies. Warhammer 40k comes in as slightly more expensive, mostly because the model count is slightly higher and less reliant on those great big centerpiece models, but we should say that as I record this, a 10th edition is about to be released that changes things up, so we'll see how this all pans out. I doubt it'll end up in a particularly different price bracket to Age of Sigmar, but who knows. Okay, this suggested list from Spiky Bits is actually pretty cost effective. This is the Scions of Macragge box plus a Space Marine Combat Patrol and 2 vehicles, giving you 2,000 points for around £280 new. On the other hand, this LVO winning tournament Blood Angels list would cost around 325 new. There's no easy bundle there. If you go with low model count armies like this Adeptus Custodes list from Goonhammer, you can get 2,000 points for about 250, but other low model count armies like this Knight list would cost upwards of 350 because of how big the models are. So if we add all that together, to get to a playable standard for an event of 40k, you'll again need a rule source. The core rule book is £40, or the current chapter approved book, which contains the current match play rules, would be £17.50. A codex for your army, dice and a tape measure, and then the models, which puts the total cost at somewhere between £300 and £400, depending on the army. But that still isn't the most expensive. There's one game left. The Horus Heresy is a mass battle game based on Warhammer 40k, but set in the colossal civil war known as the Horus Heresy. While there are smaller ways to play it, the game's probably the biggest in terms of sheer numbers of models per side, but the starter set, the Age of Darkness box set, is actually a pretty good start. It's meant to split down into 2 separate armies, kind of like all the others, but if you use them all in the same army, then you get most of the way there. The Age of Darkness box set costs 180 and contains the core rulebook and enough models to get you to 1,800 points, but you'll need one of the 2 Legion books to use them, which is another £42. A single other purchase would get you to 2,000 points for around 250 quid, but while you can play Heresy at 2,000 points, The standard for events is 3,000 points. So you could just buy 2 of these boxes, which means you're spending about £400 for an army, but maybe not a very useful or interesting one. Realistically, you're more likely to be filling out that extra 1,000 points from a mixture of other plastic box sets with dreadnoughts and tanks in. And if you do that, you're looking at £450 to £500 for a full-size army, plus all the rules, and more if you want to include any of the very cool resin units produced by Forge World. And it is worth saying that this game is aimed at the more experienced player, collector, so maybe it doesn't belong in this video anyway. But there we go. Underworlds all the way up to Heresy, how much it actually costs to get a full-size force for all of Games Workshop's mainline games. As I said, this is all Games Workshop recommended retail price. Most hobby stores will sell this with up to a 20% discount. And of course, there's also an active second-hand market, but this is just the official cost. And of course, some games like Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar can be played at much smaller scales. The problem there is mostly that people don't do it. So if you try and play that in your starter set scale, you might have difficulty finding anyone to play with. So is all of that too expensive? Well, that's kind of a hard question to answer because it kind of depends what you're comparing it to. And if we're judging by the cost of materials or the hours of enjoyment you get for it or something. A modern board game like Catan might cost as little as £25, that doesn't really include any models. A big complex board game with miniatures like Gloomhaven might be £100, which is pretty comparable to Games Workshop's skirmish games. Even other fantasy miniature games are sometimes difficult comparisons. Mantic's Kings of War and Star Wars Legion are both on the larger scale comparable to games like 40k or Age of Sigmar, and while Kings of War costs a fair bit less for an army, Star Wars Legion's kind of comparable per model, and the models really aren't up to the same standard. There are plenty of smaller skirmish games with absolutely amazing models, often resin models, but those models often cost the same or more than a comparable Games Workshop skirmish game. Or we could compare to historical games, I guess, where the models are a lot cheaper and the rules less tied to specific manufacturers. But is that the same thing? If we compare to other pastimes, well, I mean, a new games console and a single game will cost more than a Horus Heresy army, and will arguably not provide the same hours of entertainment without significantly higher spend. What else? Do we compare to other adult hobbies like skiing? I roller skate. Cheap skates, pads and a helmet will set you back £100. Good ones more like 200. Should we be comparing to that? I could go on with this, but you get the point. I guess the clever thing to do here would be to go through all of the competitors, see what games they are closest to and see how much they cost. But yeah, that's probably a different video. Anyway, there's the results. If you want to start playing Warhammer now, you can do so for as little as £40 or as much as 400, depending what you pick. Everything else is up to you. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see more videos about Warhammer, then there should be a little box coming up there on the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, and I guess me, then you can order your toy soldiers through the affiliate links below, or join the Patreon, where you get to vote on upcoming videos, see videos earlier than everyone else, and of course, join in the discussion on our Discord server. See ya!